Welcome to the 8th presentation in our series on action learning. Thank you for joining us. This presentation is about facilitation in action learning groups. I'm Carter McNamara of Authenticity Consulting. We're providing this series to make action learning more available and more accessible to everyone. This presentation is one in a series and they are best viewed in order, so please be sure to visit the website listed below for more information on the complete series as well as more information about our company. And so now, let's get started. In previous presentations, you learned all about the action learning process, including what people use the process for. You also learned how to select the best members for action learning groups, and you learned about key features of those groups as well. So in this presentation, we'll review facilitation. We use the term facilitation as well as the term facilitator because many groups do not assign a certain person to be a facilitator. Rather, they all take responsibility for the tasks of facilitation. So in this presentation, we'll review different types of facilitation. That must be decided first because decisions affect how the rest of the facilitation tasks are done. We'll look at typical duties, as well as we'll look at the skills that make for the best facilitator when one person is assigned to that role. And we'll also look at preferred and unpreferred characteristics of the best facilitators. We'll describe what we see as the best practices. And a key task of facilitation is to support the group's learning, so we'll talk about that as well. Then we'll explain some challenges that can occur in facilitation, and we'll go through each and give you ideas that you can use right away in your groups. A frequent question is, what is good facilitation? Well, sometimes there's confusion about the answer to that, so we'll give you our answer. There are different views about what facilitation should focus on. It can focus primarily on following the structures of the meeting, including the agenda and ground rules, or facilitation could focus primarily on helping members to reflect on their group process and what they're learning from it. This view often refers to the facilitator as the set advisor or the learning coach. The program should decide early on which design of facilitation that the program will use. The program also needs to decide how facilitation will be done. It's usually best to have an external facilitator early in a program so members get a good start in the action learning process. By the term external, we mean the facilitator does not get coached in the meeting. The more complex the program, the more likely it should use an external facilitator. For example, if the group is addressing a complex problem that might require much data gathering and analysis and also have frequent involvement of stakeholders, then it's more likely that an external facilitator should be used. Even if a program uses an external facilitator, should she work herself out of a job so the group eventually self-facilitates? That depends on the model or the school of action learning preferred by the designers of the program. Self-facilitation can be done where one member facilitates the entire meeting or where members rotate responsibility for different parts of the meeting. Often, the nature of facilitation is quite direct and involved at first, as members are learning the process, but then it becomes less direct during the program, as members learn more about the process themselves. Of course, that too depends on the model and the school of action learning preferred by the designers of the program. Whether the program uses an external facilitator or has members self-facilitate, the duties of facilitation have to be done. The first is to understand the purpose of the program. That usually involves the facilitator talking to the program sponsor. That would mean the external facilitator in the case of external facilitation, or the group members if they self-facilitate. A facilitator might enroll each member of the group, that is, personally contacts the member to explain, for example, the purpose of the program, describe the member's role, give a very brief description of the action learning process, hear any questions from the member, and be sure that the member knows the date of the upcoming preparatory workshop in which all members will be taught more about action learning. The facilitator might take the lead in teaching members about the action learning process. That could be done in the workshop or spread out over several group meetings if members' schedules require that. During meetings, the facilitator might model good coaching by asking useful questions. Some models of action learning believe that the facilitator should not take part in helping members with projects and should intervene only about group learning. And some models believe that the facilitator should attend to group learning at least as much, if not more, than to the agenda and ground rules, And those models might refer to a learning coach. If the group is self-facilitated, then the facilitator might be coached as a member of the group. Self-facilitation can be done by one member doing the entire meeting or by all members rotating responsibility in a meeting. Facilitators should promptly intervene if they notice that ground rules are not being followed. Ground rules in the agenda are the structures that support the design of the program and meetings. If either is changed, that can be very confusing to members. There often are certain administrative duties too, for example, to coordinate program evaluations with the program, or to report any chronic problems such as continued poor attendance. The facilitator also might share non-confidential information with the sponsor about what members are generally working on in their groups. There are some skills that are preferred in good facilitation. Let's look at those. He should be a good listener, because your job is to be there and engage with people, to hear what's important to them, what can they do about it, perhaps ask good questions. And the role of asking good questions is critically important in action learning because other members will sometimes look at you wondering, was that a good question or wasn't it? Timing interventions. And by interventions, we mean where, for example, ground rules are being broken or people have gotten away from the agenda. We think one of the most important skills is simply time management, because you're always looking at the clock, making sure people get the appropriate amount of time, letting people know when the meeting's going to be ending. That's very important. As far as group process management skills, as some people call them, sure, they should understand some basics of the process and a bit about the dynamics of groups. We think more importantly, they should be able to look at the clock and do action learning. As with skills, there are certain characteristics that are useful too. One is what we'll call just a tolerance of ambiguity, because you never really know what's going to occur in a process. And some people's personalities really take to questions. Other people kind of stutter a bit and aren't even really sure. So the personality of a group depends completely on who's getting coached. Another characteristic is to be open and frank, because if you're not being honest with group members, they'll know it, and they'll be the same way. So if you see something, you can respectfully name it to the group members and they'll respect you for it. You need patience, because some people move faster than others, and as a facilitator, you need to come from where they're at rather than at them. You need an unobtrusive manner. You can't be somebody who continually needs attention. If you have to intervene, do so indirectly and with respect. You need a desire to see people learn, because in action learning, that's what it's all about. You get to sit back, you get to watch people learn more about themselves and about others. And lastly, a strong value of trust and the ability of others to carry out their own learning. If you've got that characteristic, you can build on all of the rest. We talked about characteristics that were preferred. Let's look at some that are not preferred. If a facilitator takes too strong of a role, that can really reduce the ownership and the participation of members, and that, in turn, can really hurt their learning and their progress in meetings. But depending on the model of action learning being used, the facilitator might assertively intervene in the meeting. For example, when there is a good occasion to point out something that just happened that members could learn from. But the facilitator can overdo it. For example, if he is a performer, where he really needs strong attention, he needs continually to be getting the adulation of the group, so he's always asking for attention, that won't work. If he's very directive, if the way he works with the group is to say, well, what you really need to do now, and what you really should do now, instead it's, I've noticed that this would be helpful, do you want to do that? Another is if he constantly interrupts others. One of the worst things you can do is when somebody's working on something that's confidential, something that's really important, in comes the facilitator and interrupts. You don't want to do that. Or we've even seen facilitators get defensive. They'll say, well, I was just trying to do the following, and they'll apologize, and what they've done is pretty much undercut their own authority and their credibility. Or, even worse, if the facilitator suddenly changes the agenda, suddenly changes the ground rules. And it's interesting because when that happens, the group members often will go along, but after the meeting, they might not even come back. The worst thing a facilitator can do is to break the confidentiality of the group. And that would be, for example, if he leaves the room and he goes to somebody else and says, gosh, Bob, the member, was working on the following thing. That would be toxic. It rarely happens. We've hired hundreds of facilitators. It's probably happened once or twice, and it was never intentional. It was just a mistake. So those are characteristics that are not preferred. We've learned that there are certain practices that can make a big difference in the quality of facilitation. Ideally, even though these are facilitator tasks, the members themselves would start to do some of the tasks so they eventually learn how to do them as well. The first is to follow the agenda. Different models of action learning might have different agendas even though they follow the same overall action learning process or framework, so the facilitator needs to know the agenda that's intended for the program. Regardless of whether a program is single project or multi-project, usually there's an opening that the facilitator leads. It might include a welcome, quick review of ground rules, perhaps a review of good coaching techniques, and then quiet time too, where each member thinks about what he or she wants from the meeting. Usually there's a closing at the end of the meeting, in which members might share impressions of the meeting, document their learnings and intended actions, and verify the date and time of the next meeting. It's extremely important that the facilitator effectively manages time in meetings. Action learning is a rather structured process. If any part of the meeting is rushed, that can really damage the power of the process for everyone. A sidebar is when two or more members start talking amongst themselves rather than focusing and helping the presenter. The facilitator or other members should get the attention of those in the sidebar and redirect it back to the presenter. The overall purpose of the coaching is to help the presenter. So one of the best questions that can be asked to a presenter is this coaching helpful to you? If the coaching is not helpful, then the facilitator or other members might ask, well, what would be more helpful? The presenter should take charge of his time in the meeting. In programs with a facilitator focused primarily on group learning, for example, having a learning coach, then the focus should be on group learning, as well as asking the group, what are we learning and what can we do with that? How can we make our process even better? There are some tasks that facilitators can do that really help members to cultivate more learning for themselves and for their group. If the program is using an external facilitator, it's very useful if he focuses especially on the meeting agenda, ground rules, helping the group to learn from their activities in the meeting. Of course, that depends again on the particular model being used. Some models assert that the facilitator does not engage in coaching the presenter to address his or her issue. Regardless of the model, he should never or very rarely do the actions for members or have tasks that members delegate to him. It's good practice for him to ask, is everyone clear on what the project or problem is for that presenter? That really helps them to focus when they do coaching. During meetings, be sure that members are focused on the presenter's project. For example, we had an occasion where a member wanted some coaching to feel better about firing her employees. She explained that she had gone through the right personnel procedures, but she just wanted to feel better about it. Another member started asking the presenter about her time management. That is, the member lost focus of what the presenter was really working on. In that case, the facilitator or another member should really intervene to turn to the presenter and say, do you want to talk about time management? Is that helpful to you? It's very useful to occasionally and quickly ask the group, is this really helping the presenter to learn? For example, are we asking questions to help the presenter to clarify her perceptions? Any assumptions that she's making? Any conclusions that she's having in this meeting? It's also very useful to build in debriefs in a meeting. For example, times when members step aside from focusing on the presenter and instead talk about the quality of their meeting so far and what they're learning. At the end of a time slot, it's a great time to take a couple of minutes and visit, what was the quality of our coaching? Was it really helpful? Or, near the end of the meeting, ask the group about the quality of the meeting, what could have been improved, what did we learn? Always be sure to hear from several or even all of the members, not just one. And then also ask members to be sure that the actions that members select are really relevant to addressing the project. Are they realistic to do before the next meeting? Especially with people who are struggling with time and stress management, it's important to help them to stay realistic in their expectations. So the facilitator could ask the group, for example, Does everyone agree that the actions are specific, that they're relevant, and that they're realistic? Although it seems rare in action learning meetings, there occasionally are situations where the facilitator should step in to address a situation. In experience groups, the members themselves might step in to address the situation too. Let's look at some of them. Sometimes a member seems to push an opinion, for example, strongly suggest what the presenter should do to address her project. One of the best ways to address this is simply to ask the presenter, "Is this helpful to you?" Because sometimes the presenter is really benefiting from the other member, but others don't realize it. Another situation is when the presenter or another member seems to be talking too long and seems to be using up most of the time for the presenter. It's useful again to ask the presenter, "Is this helpful?" Because the presenter might actually just want to talk or vent for a while. The question might alert the presenter or member that she's talking too much. Occasionally, a member will not have a project for a meeting or might not want to present in a meeting, especially in a multi-project program. Perhaps the ground rules for the meeting allow members to pass or to not take a time slot. Still, there are ways that the member can participate. For example, some programs allow a member to just talk about what he did last month and what he will do next month. It's common then that other members naturally start to ask questions, and they even end up helping the member a lot anyway. When a member continually does not have a project or wants to pass, then the facilitator or the group should tactfully remind the member that she signed up with a commitment to participate. If the member still is reluctant, then perhaps the program should arrange for the member to leave the group. Occasionally, there can be ineffective coaching, which means that the presenter is not getting his needs met or the organization is not getting it met in a single project program. That can happen for numerous reasons, and some of them are because of poor program design and others because of poor facilitation. But the bottom line is that the presenter must assert that she's not getting her needs met. Then the facilitator and members should work to understand why. Is it because the project is unclear or members not focused on the project? Finally, sometimes there's a member who's continually quiet. If a member has not spoken for a long time, for example for 20 minutes or more, then it's appropriate for the facilitator or another member to tactfully ask, "Do you have anything to add in the coaching now?" Many times the quiet member has very good questions, but is either a bit unsure or too shy to ask the question, or the member may simply be having a bad day. Being invited to speak can make a huge difference. There's often a misunderstanding that facilitation is successful only if the group has somehow solved the problem for each member who got coached. That's not correct. While opinions about what success really is may differ, we're offering ours here. We think success is that the facilitator has attended to the ground rules, has followed the agenda that people have agreed on, and is following the action learning process that they've been trained on as well. He's looking to make sure that people are participating fully. He's helping the group to nurture learning by continuing to ask, "Is this what we want to do? What's your role in it? What could we be doing better? What are we learning?" Most of all, though, if the facilitator is attending to the group, is making sure that all the confidential information stays in the room, and is showing up honestly, that's a successful facilitator. Thank you for viewing this presentation. We hope you'll go on to the next one. You might benefit from the following resources to add even more detail to our overviews of action learning. The website Action Learning Central references an extensive amount of free resources, including about the action learning process, each of its key elements, examples of action learning programs, and tools for each aspect of action learning. There's even an action learning glossary with definitions for each of the common terms in action learning. Our company, Authenticity Consulting, also is available to answer your questions or to help you in any other way. Our firm does very successful action learning groups around the world and for a wide variety of outcomes and applications. There's also the free management library at managementhelp.org. You can find resources and tools for almost any activity in the workplace, including for many of the activities in action learning. You can find more about each of these three resources by going to actionlearningcentral.com/gratis and select the presentation entitled General Resources for Action Learning. Thank you.